My son raised his glass at Christmas dinner and smiled as he told everyone he paid me $5,000 a month. I almost dropped my fork because I had no idea what he was talking about. Then I turned to his wife and asked one quiet question, and the room went completely silent. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales, because this story proves it. I almost didn't go. The invitation had arrived a week before Christmas, tucked between bills and a few holiday catalogs, and even as I held it in my hands, I felt a strange mix of irritation and hesitation. It wasn't just any invitation. It was from my son, the one I hadn't really seen in months, if not years. He had built a life so far from the one I knew that sometimes I felt like I was reading about a stranger in the newspaper rather than my own blood. Yet here it was, a crisp, embossed card that practically screamed wealth, prestige, and, most painfully, obligation. The words were polite enough, formal almost, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent that cut deeper than any casual snub. "We would be honored if you joined us for Christmas dinner." It read, "Your presence is always valued by the family." And yet, I knew the truth. I was being invited for the show, for appearances, not for the warmth of my son's company. The family he was referencing wasn't just the people I had raised or nurtured. It was the crowd that circled around him now, drawn by his success, dazzled by his bank account, and clearly unfamiliar with who I was beyond my role as his father. I placed the card on the counter and stared at it for a long while, thinking about the man he had become. My son had always been ambitious, but somewhere along the line, ambition had mutated into a display of wealth and power, a way to measure himself against everyone else, including me. I remembered his childhood. Late night stories read at the edge of his bed, scraped knees, shy smiles, and the small victories that mattered to a boy trying to navigate a big world. Those memories felt almost foreign now, like snapshots of someone else's life, overexposed and fading. The question that kept gnawing at me was simply, should I even go? Pride fought with the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that still cared. I imagined walking into the grand house, its facade decorated with twinkling lights, wreaths hanging symmetrically on every door, and the air smelling of pine, roasted meats, and expensive candles. I could see him greeting me at the door with a tight, rehearsed smile, shaking my hand, just long enough to show warmth, but short enough to remind me who was really in control. I sighed and poured myself a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward, and wondered when our conversations had become so formal. Had I really raised a man who could so easily put distance between us, who could sit across from me at a dining table filled with friends and associates, talking about deals and investments, without acknowledging the years that had shaped him? I took a slow sip, bitter and grounding, letting the liquid burn away some of the tension in my chest. Part of me wanted to write back, politely declining. After all, I had my own life, my own routines, and my own dignity to preserve. But another part, the part that remembered all those nights spent worrying about him, paying for little league fees, and sneaking him extra snacks when I couldn't afford them, whispered that I should go. Maybe, just maybe, I could remind him, and everyone else, that I wasn't just a name on a guest list or a token presence for show. Maybe I could walk in and quietly assert the dignity I had earned over decades. I hesitated at the edge of the decision, pacing the small living room of my modest apartment. It was nothing like his house would be. No grand chandeliers, no marble floors, no valet service. Just a few worn armchairs, a modest Christmas tree in the corner that had seen better days, and the faint smell of old pine, scented cleaner. It was humble, yes, but it was mine. Every piece held a memory, a story of a life built with sweat and small joys, not stock options or acquisitions. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, I had made up my mind. I would go, not to beg for attention, not to ask for gifts or favors, and certainly not to be paraded around like some sort of token elder. I would go to remind myself that, no matter how far my son had drifted into the world of wealth and influence, I still had a place in this family. Perhaps it would be uncomfortable. Perhaps it would be awkward. But there was a sense of resolve in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, a quiet promise that tonight I would not be invisible. I dressed carefully, choosing something simple yet respectable. A dark blazer over a clean shirt, comfortable slacks, and polished shoes. Nothing ostentatious, nothing flashy. I wasn't here to impress, I was here to be present. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, gray hair slightly unkempt, the lines around my eyes deeper than I cared to admit, and I allowed myself a small smile. This was who I was, and tonight, I would carry that with confidence. The drive to his house felt surreal. I passed neighborhood after neighborhood of perfectly trimmed lawns, elaborate holiday displays, and cars that cost more than my entire monthly rent. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, feeling the familiar mix of envy, pride, and lingering resentment. My son had made a life I could never have imagined for myself, and yet, somewhere beneath the glitter and excess, he was still my child. That thought was both comforting and infuriating. When I finally arrived, I took a moment to compose myself before walking up the long driveway. The house was massive, a modern mansion that seemed to stretch endlessly in both width and height, lights twinkling in every window, the kind of house that belonged in magazines or on reality TV shows. A valet took my car keys, and I followed the path lined with perfectly pruned bushes to the front door. He opened it before I could knock, as if he had been expecting me at the exact moment I arrived. His smile was sharp, controlled, and just a little too bright. "Dad," he said, his tone warm but rehearsed. "So glad you could make it." He embraced me quickly, patted my back, and led me inside. The foyer was enormous, every surface gleaming, every corner decorated with festive ornaments that looked expensive enough to make a grown man wince. "Wow," I said, trying to sound impressed though my stomach tightened at the ostentation. "You really went all out." He laughed. "Of course. Christmas is the perfect time for family, right?" His eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway, where a group of guests mingled, men and women in tailored suits, dresses that shimmered under the chandelier lights, all sipping champagne and chatting animatedly. Not a single one of them looked remotely familiar, except for his wife. She was standing a few feet away, her posture impeccable, a glass of champagne in hand, her smile polite but measured. She caught my glance and nodded slightly, a small gesture of acknowledgement. I nodded back, realizing instantly that this would not be an easy night. She was a woman of control, a master at reading the room, and I had a sinking feeling she had already sized me up and placed me in the proper social category. The father, financially irrelevant, slightly out of place, and entirely expendable in her carefully curated world. We exchanged pleasantries, small talk about the weather, the city, the holiday season. Every word felt like navigating a minefield. One misstep, one casual comment, and I could easily become the punchline of the evening. Yet I persisted, reminding myself that tonight was not about fitting in or seeking approval. Tonight was about being seen as who I was, a man who had raised a son, worked hard, and earned his place in the world, whether anyone recognized it or not. Dinner was scheduled for 7, and I was introduced to the other guests, a mix of business associates, family friends, and distant cousins whose names I struggled to remember. Conversations were filled with investment strategies, real estate deals, and anecdotes that sounded impressive but carried no real emotional weight. I smiled politely, laughed at the occasional joke, and nodded as if I belonged, all the while feeling the subtle sting of exclusion. I was here, physically present, but the emotional connection, the one I craved, was absent. As we moved toward the dining room, I caught a glimpse of my son again, now animatedly speaking about a new business venture with a few of his friends. He looked successful, confident, and entirely self-assured. The picture of the man who had conquered the world. And yet, I couldn't help but notice the slight tightness in his eyes, the hint of something rehearsed in his smile. He was performing, and I realized with a quiet pang that much of tonight would be a performance. I reminded myself that I didn't need his validation, that my presence alone mattered. I had chosen to be here, and that choice was mine and mine alone. Whatever happened tonight, I would face it with dignity. And deep down, beneath the nerves and the subtle dread, there was a flicker of anticipation. Maybe this year, the story would be different. Maybe this year, I would find a way to remind everyone, most importantly my son, that respect and truth carried more weight than money, appearances, or social games. I took a deep breath and followed him into the dining room, my heart steadying despite the nerves. The table was magnificent. Crystal glasses catching the light, silverware polished to a mirror shine, candles flickering gently in ornate holders, and a centerpiece so elaborate it looked more like art than decoration. I sat down where he directed, at a place that was conspicuously at the head of the table, but slightly removed from the main cluster of guests. I noticed it immediately. I was being placed where I could see everything, but where no one would be forced to interact with me unless I initiated it. As I settled into my seat, I glanced around, taking in the lavish spread. Roast turkey glistened under the soft light, mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, cranberry sauce shaped like little domes, and an array of side dishes I couldn't even begin to name. Everything was beautiful, expensive, perfect, but to me, it felt hollow. This was a world I had worked hard to provide for my family in small, meaningful ways, and yet here it was, turned into a spectacle that reminded me of my own modest apartment and the quiet, unremarkable life I led. And then, just as the tension began to settle into a dull background hum, he raised his glass. The room quieted slightly, as if expecting some grand declaration, and I felt my stomach tighten. Whatever was coming next, I knew it would be about appearances, about proving something to these guests, and almost certainly about money. I took another slow breath, reminding myself to remain calm, to keep my dignity intact, and to observe carefully. After all, tonight, I wasn't just a guest. I was a witness. I had barely settled into my seat when I realized just how out of place I truly was. The dining room stretched on in a way that made my modest apartment feel like a shoebox in comparison. Every surface gleamed. Polished wood, delicate china, sparkling crystal glasses that reflected the chandelier light like miniature prisms. The centerpiece alone, a towering arrangement of red and white roses, entwined with pine and glittering ornaments, could have been mistaken for a museum installation. I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten, and reminded myself that I was here to maintain my dignity, not to marvel at the extravagance. My son, ever the social conductor, introduced me to the guests seated around me. There were executives from his latest ventures, women whose designer dresses sparkled under the candlelight, and men in crisp suits whose conversation hovered somewhere between business and self-congratulation. I nodded politely, offered firm handshakes, and smiled when appropriate, but there was a constant awareness gnawing at me, a sense that I was being judged not as a person, but as a symbol. "How long has it been since we last saw you?" one of the women asked, her voice light but her eyes calculating. I couldn't place her, and I suspected she didn't care to know. "Months," I replied carefully, measuring my tone so that it conveyed politeness without desperation. She smiled, a practiced expression, and returned to her conversation with another guest, as if I had never spoken. I felt the sting but kept my composure. This wasn't the moment to show any sign of discomfort. The daughter-in-law, standing across the table, caught my glance and offered a polite nod. Her smile was warm in the same way a museum guide's smile is warm, calculated, intentional, designed to make one feel acknowledged, but never truly welcome. I nodded back, a small acknowledgement of her presence, and tried to focus on the finer details of the room. The silverware gleamed, the napkins were folded with precision, and the tablecloth was pristine. Everything here was perfect, but there was a coldness that seeped through, a subtle reminder that this world was not built for me. Conversation drifted around me in a steady hum of superficial engagement. Business deals were discussed as casually as weather, and investments were dropped into sentences with the ease of someone tossing coins into a fountain. I listened, nodding occasionally, offering a neutral smile and let my mind wander. I thought of the years I had spent working multiple jobs, scraping together what little we had, and quietly providing for my son. There was no crystal chandelier in our apartment, no catered meals, no hand-picked ornaments. Just small acts of love, quiet sacrifices, and a steady hand guiding him through childhood. And yet, here I was, seated at a table where every word, every gesture, was a performance designed to impress, not to connect. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the one that always appeared when I realized just how far we had drifted apart. My son had built a life so polished, so carefully curated, that I could hardly recognize it as his own. He was charming, confident, and every word he spoke carried the weight of wealth and authority. And yet, beneath the surface, I detected a subtle tension, almost imperceptible, a slight stiffness in his posture, a flicker of unease in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Perhaps he, too, was aware of the precariousness of this carefully constructed world. As the appetizers were served, I observed the interactions around me with careful attention. The guests laughed at jokes I barely understood, exchanged knowing glances that excluded me, and casually checked their phones, as if the room itself was a stage upon which they were mere performers. I felt my pulse quicken, a mixture of envy, pride, and an underlying sadness that threatened to spill over. I reminded myself to breathe, to maintain the calm exterior I had cultivated over decades of navigating life's challenges. My son leaned over at one point, his voice low and smooth, intended only for me. "Dad, relax," he said with a practiced ease. "Enjoy the evening. It's Christmas." There was a warmth in his tone, but it was fleeting, almost mechanical. I nodded, offering a smile that I hoped conveyed appreciation without vulnerability. I wasn't here to be coddled. I was here to observe, to endure, and, if the moment arose, to assert myself in a way that would not compromise my dignity. The daughter-in-law approached then, placing a hand lightly on my shoulder as she spoke. "I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice a perfect balance of sincerity and formality. I returned her nod with a polite smile, noting the subtle tension in her posture. She was a master at maintaining control, ensuring that every interaction served her purpose. I could sense the careful calculations behind her eyes, the way she measured my reactions, and I understood immediately that she was a gatekeeper in this meticulously crafted world. As the main courses were brought out, the conversation shifted to holiday traditions, charitable donations, and the upcoming year's social calendar. I nodded along, interjecting occasionally with neutral comments, but I could feel the subtle dismissals, the way my words seemed to vanish into the air, acknowledged politely but never truly received. It was as if I existed in a parallel plane, physically present but emotionally sidelined, a guest in a world that I had once helped shape, but no longer belonged to. Despite the discomfort, I found moments of quiet observation that brought me a sense of clarity. I noticed the way my son's friends deferred to him in conversation, hanging on his every word, laughing at jokes I didn't hear, and offering nods of agreement at points that seemed inconsequential. I realized that the real performance tonight wasn't the lavish meal, the sparkling decorations, or even the polite conversation. It was my son himself, a man who had mastered the art of influence, charm, and control, and who carried it effortlessly into every interaction. And yet, I reminded myself, every performance has cracks, however small. I had spent enough years observing human behavior to know that no matter how polished someone appears, the truth has a way of slipping through. I didn't know when or how, but I sensed that tonight, a truth was waiting to emerge, quietly, under the surface. That thought gave me a subtle thrill, a flicker of anticipation that contrasted with the unease settling in my stomach. As the main course progressed, I found myself reflecting on the years that had led to this moment. The sacrifices, the late nights, the constant worry about his well-being, all culminating in this evening where he sat across from me, polished and successful, surrounded by people who admired him for what he had, not for who he was. And yet, despite the distance, the coldness, and the subtle slights, I still felt a deep, unshakable bond, a paternal thread that connected me to this man, no matter how far he had wandered into the world of wealth and performance. The daughter-in-law excused herself briefly, and I noticed a subtle shift in the room during her absence. The guests seemed slightly more relaxed, the laughter a touch more genuine, as if her presence imposed a level of tension that disappeared when she stepped away. It confirmed what I had suspected. She was a force of control, a silent orchestrator, ensuring that every interaction aligned with her vision of the evening. I made a mental note of it, filing the observation away for later, knowing that it could play a crucial role in the events yet to unfold. By the time the wine had been poured, and the conversation had drifted to holiday travel plans, I had established a quiet rhythm for myself. Listen, observe, smile politely, and remain steady. I was determined not to be swept away by the performance, to maintain my perspective and my composure, and to be ready for the moment when truth might surface. I could feel it coming, a tension in the air that hinted at a revelation, a subtle shift that suggested tonight would not end as neatly as it had begun. I caught my son's eye across the table, and he raised his glass in a small, almost imperceptible gesture. I returned it with a polite nod, sensing a faint flicker of unease in his expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I saw it. He was confident, yes, but there was an underlying tension, a recognition that I was not as passive as he assumed. The thought gave me a quiet satisfaction, a sense that perhaps, tonight, the balance of power was not as one-sided as it appeared. And then, just as the conversation began to lull, my son cleared his throat, a small but deliberate action that immediately drew the attention of the room. All eyes turned toward him, and I felt a tightening in my chest, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The moment had arrived, the moment I had sensed all evening, the one that would set the stage for the events to come. I straightened in my chair, took a slow, steadying breath, and prepared myself for whatever words would emerge from his perfectly rehearsed mouth. The room was silent now, the faint hum of background chatter fading into the tense pause that precedes a revelation. My son's eyes flicked briefly to me, and I could see the spark of confidence that had carried him through so many boardrooms and social gatherings. He was ready to perform, to assert his control, to shape the narrative of the evening in his favor. But I, too, was ready. I had observed, I had prepared, and I had the patience to wait for the right moment. As he raised his glass, the words began to form, and I felt the subtle shift in energy around the table. This was it, the pivot point, the moment when appearances would collide with reality, when truth would test the carefully constructed world he had built. I met his gaze calmly, unwavering, and allowed a small, knowing smile to touch my lips. Tonight, I would be present not just in body, but in mind, heart, and spirit. I would not be dismissed, overlooked, or made invisible. And with that, he spoke. Dinner had settled into a rhythm, the clinking of silverware punctuating conversations that drifted between polite jokes and the occasional boast about business deals. I had learned to navigate the currents, smiling at the right moments, nodding when necessary, and keeping my emotions tucked beneath a calm exterior. But I sensed it. Something was about to happen, and the room's subtle tension told me it would center on me, whether I liked it or not. My son cleared his throat, a signal so practiced it could have been choreographed. The room quieted immediately, all eyes turning toward him, the energy in the air thick with anticipation. I straightened in my seat, knowing the moment had arrived, the moment he would demonstrate control, assert authority, and remind everyone of his place in this carefully orchestrated world. He smiled a polished, charismatic grin and raised his glass. "I just want to take a moment tonight," he began, his voice smooth and commanding, "to talk about family." There was a slight pause, a beat designed to make the statement linger in the air. I kept my own glass steady, my eyes meeting his for a brief moment, the weight of years and unspoken truths passing silently between us. "You all know how important family is to me," he continued, gesturing toward the guests with one hand, the other holding his glass aloft. "And I want to make sure that the people who matter most are taken care of." The guests nodded appreciatively, some murmuring in agreement, their expressions a mixture of admiration and envy. I could feel the subtle shift in the room. He was performing, and everyone, except perhaps me, was playing along. Then came the words that made my stomach tighten and my fork hover in mid-air. "That's why," he said, leaning slightly forward with a tone meant to impress. "I make sure my father is well supported. I pay him $5,000 a month, so he can enjoy life comfortably." The room erupted into polite applause and murmurs of approval. Guests leaned in, smiling, some patting my shoulder in a performative gesture of respect. My heart raced, but not from gratitude or pride. I was frozen, confused, and the words felt like a slap delivered in slow motion. $5,000 a month. I hadn't received a cent. Not a check, not a deposit. Not a single trace of this alleged generosity. I forced myself to remain calm, to let the moment hang in the air without reacting. I could feel the eyes of the guests on me now, waiting for a smile, a word of thanks, a gesture that would validate the claim. And yet, my mind was spinning, trying to process what had just been said. Had he truly believed I would accept this lie without question? Had he assumed I would play the part of the grateful father, nodding and smiling, while being humiliated in front of his friends and colleagues? I set my fork down quietly, my hands resting lightly on the table as I allowed the applause to fade. My son's smile widened, as if sensing my hesitation and mistaking it for awe. He had always been clever, always confident in his ability to control the narrative. But this time, he had miscalculated. This time, he had underestimated my patience, my observation, and my ability to remain composed under pressure. I turned my gaze toward his wife, the woman who had orchestrated so many aspects of this evening with silent precision. Her posture shifted slightly when our eyes met, a subtle tightening in her shoulders that I noticed instantly. She froze, her hand hovering above her glass as if caught mid-motion. The room seemed to contract around us, the murmurs of admiration fading into a tense, expectant silence. I could see the color drain from her face, the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes. She knew the truth. She had always known. And in that moment, The facade she maintained for the rest of the room faltered. I spoke softly, my voice calm but deliberate, carrying just enough volume for her to hear. "Is that true?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, almost conversational. "Have you really been sending me $5,000 a month?" The room shifted again, a subtle ripple of tension passing through the guests. Conversations died down as heads turned. Curiosity piqued. Some of the guests exchanged glances, sensing that something significant had just occurred, though they had no idea what. My son's confident smile faltered ever so slightly, the first crack in his polished exterior. He blinked, caught off guard by my question, by the calm authority in my tone, by the implication that he had been exposed. His wife's lips parted, but no words came out. She was frozen, trapped in a moment of silent acknowledgement. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the recognition that the lie had been discovered, the fear of the social consequences, and perhaps a twinge of guilt that had no place in the polished world she maintained. She avoided looking at me directly, her gaze flicking briefly to my son before settling somewhere inconspicuous in the room. My son, now fully aware that his claim was about to be challenged, opened his mouth, attempting to recover the moment. "Oh, well, Dad, it's the thought that counts," he stammered, trying to sound casual, as if the words themselves could rewrite reality. The gesture was weak, unconvincing, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing him unravel so subtly, yet completely in front of the very people whose admiration he craved. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse him, and I didn't allow anger to leak into my expression. I simply let the silence linger, letting the truth of my unspoken words hang in the air. The room was waiting now. The tension, so thick that I could almost feel it pressing against my chest. The polite applause from a moment ago had vanished, replaced by an almost tangible expectation. The guests were waiting to see how this revelation would unfold, and I could sense the shift in the balance of power. "I'm curious," I continued, my voice measured, "because I don't seem to recall receiving any of that money. Perhaps I missed something." I allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips. Not smugness, not mockery, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. My words were simple, calm, and deliberate, carrying a weight far greater than any raised voice could achieve. My son's eyes darted toward his wife, searching for an anchor, a lifeline, some signal that would allow him to regain control of the narrative. But she remained frozen, her composure shattered for the first time all evening. I could see the tension radiating from her, a silent admission of complicity that needed no words. She knew the truth, and now, so did everyone else. The guests were whispering among themselves, their curiosity now fully engaged. Some leaned forward slightly, their attention caught by the subtle drama unfolding before them. Others glanced at their phones, perhaps sensing the potential for gossip or social media content. I allowed myself a brief inward chuckle, amused by the spectacle of social dynamics at play. This was not about confrontation or humiliation. It was about revealing the truth with quiet dignity. My son's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands tightening slightly around his glass. He was calculating, trying to think several steps ahead. But I could see that the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The claim that had once elevated him in the eyes of the guests now threatened to expose him as a man who had assumed too much, a man who had overplayed his hand. I leaned back slightly, maintaining my composure, and allowed a pause long enough for the silence to grow heavy, almost uncomfortable. The tension was a living thing in the room, pressing on every surface, weaving itself through every glance, every subtle gesture. I could feel the weight of years, of unspoken grievances, and the quiet authority of my presence shaping the moment. Without a single raised voice, Finally, my son cleared his throat again, a weak attempt at regaining some semblance of control. "Well, you see," he began, but his words faltered, the explanation insufficient, unconvincing, and entirely transparent. The guests were perceptive enough to sense that this was not a minor social faux pas, but a crack in the carefully maintained illusion of wealth, generosity, and control. I kept my expression neutral, allowing the tension to build without releasing it. The room had shifted. The energy now dominated by subtle shock, curiosity, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the narrative had been challenged. I could see the unease radiating from my son, the fear flickering in his wife's eyes, and the anticipation in the eyes of the guests, who were beginning to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. And in that charged silence, I realized the power of patience, observation, and quiet confidence. I hadn't needed to raise my voice, shout, or demand answers. I had simply asked one question, delivered with calm precision, and it had undone the performance that my son and daughter-in-law had so carefully constructed. The room, once filled with admiration and polite applause, now held its breath, waiting for the next move, aware that the equilibrium had shifted irreversibly. The silence in the dining room stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, like a thick fog that refused to lift. My son's confident mask had crumbled, leaving him exposed and fumbling in a sea of polite eyes that now watched with genuine curiosity. His wife sat frozen, as if caught between panic and disbelief, her carefully maintained composure slipping with every second. The truth, long buried beneath layers of arrogance and performance, was finally ready to surface. I allowed the pause to linger, sipping my wine slowly, as if to emphasize the calm patience that had become my weapon. The guests shifted in their seats, murmurs rising quietly as they sensed the tension had escalated beyond ordinary holiday banter. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply needed to let the room sit in that charged expectation. Everyone was waiting for an explanation, for a confrontation, for some dramatic spectacle, but I intended to deliver none of that. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," I began, my tone neutral but deliberate, carrying a subtle authority that made people lean in instinctively. "You see, I've kept careful records over the years, including bank statements and correspondence. And as far as I can tell, I haven't received a single payment from you." My eyes swept the room slowly, making sure each guest caught the weight of my words. There was no anger in my voice, only calm certainty, the kind that leaves no room for denial. My son's face went pale, the color draining rapidly as the implications of my words hit him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the usual confidence that had carried him through boardrooms and social circles deserted him entirely. He fumbled for words, muttering something about transfers and payroll that didn't sound convincing even to his own ears. I let him struggle. I didn't need to interrupt or argue. His facade was unraveling on its own. His wife's hand hovered over her glass, trembling slightly. I could see the subtle signs of her inner panic, the tightened jaw, the rapid blink, the barely perceptible shift in posture. She had known the truth, had perhaps even orchestrated some of the deceit, and now she was trapped in the silence of exposure. Every guest at the table could sense it. The careful image of perfection, generosity, and wealth had faltered, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable truth. I continued, my voice steady and calm, letting the weight of reality sink in. "I've always respected your success, son, and I've never questioned your achievements. But it seems that the $5,000 a month you mentioned tonight, well, it doesn't exist. At least, not in any way that I have received or benefited from." I paused, letting the words hang like a spotlight illuminating a hidden truth. The room was entirely silent now, every eye fixed on us, every mind working to reconcile the disparity between claim and reality. He finally found his voice, weak and strained. "Dad, it's just, I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The effort to justify himself sounded hollow, unconvincing, and entirely transparent. His wife shifted in her seat, glancing at him, then at me, as if silently begging for some kind of intervention that could salvage the illusion they had constructed. But the moment had passed. The balance of power had shifted, and I knew it. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the tension but not conceding any ground. "It's not about the money," I said quietly, letting the truth cut deeper than any raised voice could. "It's about respect. And tonight, I've realized that respect cannot be bought or performed. It must be earned, and it must be genuine." My eyes met his wife's briefly, and I saw her flinch. She had known the truth all along, had perhaps assumed I would remain silent, complicit in the charade of generosity and control. But I had waited, observed, and chosen the right moment to reveal what she and my son had tried to hide. The guests were leaning in now, the tension in the room palpable. Whispers began to ripple around the table, eyes darting between my son, his wife, and me. Some faces reflected surprise, others confusion, and a few carried a spark of admiration for the quiet authority I had exercised. It was subtle, but the shift was unmistakable. The social hierarchy, meticulously constructed over the years by wealth, appearances, and performance, had been challenged in a single, calm revelation. My son's attempts to recover were feeble. He gestured vaguely toward his wallet, muttering something about transfers and timing, but no one believed him. I remained calm, allowing the truth to speak louder than any argument could. The daughter-in-law finally opened her mouth, but all she could manage was a stammered, barely audible attempt at justification. She had nothing concrete to offer, only the silent acknowledgement of complicity that had been apparent from the moment I asked my simple question. I leaned back slightly, keeping my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, and my voice calm. "It's clear that tonight, there are lessons to be learned," I said softly, ensuring that the room absorbed the weight of the statement. "One cannot assume loyalty, respect, or trust simply because it suits convenience or appearances, and one cannot claim generosity that doesn't exist and expect it to go unchallenged." I let the words settle, letting them resonate with the guests who had been watching in rapt attention. The room remained silent, the hum of social chatter suspended in the wake of the revelation. My son's friends shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging furtive glances as they processed what had just happened. The daughter-in-law sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, unable to maintain the illusion any longer, and I, calmly observing, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. This was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about asserting truth and dignity in a moment that demanded it. I could see the internal struggle in my son's eyes. Pride, embarrassment, and panic collided in rapid succession, leaving him exposed in a way that no amount of wealth or social polish could conceal. He had assumed control of the evening, assumed authority over perception, and assumed that the truth could be manipulated or ignored. But he had underestimated patience, observation, and the quiet power of a father who had chosen the right moment to speak. I took another slow sip of wine, allowing the subtle pause to stretch, giving the room time to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. The tension was nearly tangible, and yet, beneath it, there was a sense of clarity. The truth had been spoken, and it could not be denied. The guests were aware now, the daughter-in-law was aware, and most importantly, my son was aware that the illusion of control had slipped from his grasp. Finally, I addressed the room more broadly, allowing my voice to carry calm authority without aggression. Christmas is a time for honesty, for reflection, and for genuine connection, I said, letting each word land with deliberate clarity. Tonight, I hope we all remember that the value of family is measured not in money, appearances, or gestures that can be performed, but in truth, respect, and understanding. Everything else is secondary. I felt a subtle shift in energy as I spoke. The guests leaned in, some nodding slightly, others glancing at each other with newfound understanding. The daughter-in-law's eyes darted toward my son, silently communicating frustration and fear. And my son, for the first time, looked genuinely humbled. The words had struck deeper than any confrontation or argument could have. The moral authority had shifted quietly, but irrevocably, and I was fully aware of it. In that moment, I realized the true power of patience and observation. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded answers or engaged in theatrics. I had simply spoken the truth, calmly and deliberately, and allowed the weight of reality to do what performance, charm, and wealth could not: reveal the cracks in a carefully constructed facade. As the room slowly absorbed the truth, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. The tension had not been resolved through aggression, humiliation, or spectacle, but through quiet assertion of fact and dignity. The daughter-in-law's freeze had served as confirmation. The guest's curiosity had amplified the moment, and my son had been forced to confront the reality he had tried to manipulate. It was a subtle victory, but one that carried immense weight. I settled back in my chair, maintaining composure, letting the moment linger without rushing to closure. The truth had been revealed, the moral balance had shifted, and the room now held a new awareness. I had regained control, not through confrontation, but through observation, patience, and calm authority. And in that realization, I found a deep sense of satisfaction that went far beyond the superficial measures of wealth, performance, or approval. The room remained silent for a long moment after my words had landed. The tension that had built over the course of the evening hung thickly, palpable to everyone present. I could see it in my son's eyes: hesitation, embarrassment, and something resembling regret. His wife sat rigid, still frozen, a hand pressed lightly over her mouth, as if trying to hold in words that might only make the situation worse. The guests, once dazzled by wealth and polish, now whispered quietly among themselves, uncertain of where the evening had shifted. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the weight of my presence sink in. I had made my point. I had revealed the truth, exposed the cracks in their performance, and asserted a quiet authority that money and appearances could never buy. There was no need for further words, no need for confrontation or dramatic speeches. Dignity, I had learned long ago, carried more weight than anger, more power than humiliation. And tonight, it had done what nothing else could. I stood slowly, making sure the movement was calm, controlled, and deliberate. My son and his wife looked at me, as if expecting some outburst, some desperate plea for acknowledgement or justification. But there was none. I simply stood, straightened my jacket, and allowed my gaze to sweep the room, acknowledging the silent attention without arrogance or pride. My composure alone spoke volumes. "Thank you for the dinner," I said evenly, my voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "It has been enlightening." I offered a small, polite nod and turned toward the door. The room held its collective breath. I could feel every eye on me, watching, waiting, sensing that this departure was more than just a polite exit. It was a statement. The daughter-in-law's lips parted slightly, perhaps to speak, perhaps to protest. But I didn't pause. I didn't give her the satisfaction of argument, or the chance to mitigate the moment. My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the tightness in his shoulders, betraying the discomfort that words could not. They had assumed control of the narrative, but I had claimed it in a quiet, unshakable way that no apology or explanation could fully reverse. As I walked down the long, polished hallway toward the front door. I allowed myself a brief glance at the house. The decorations, the gleaming surfaces, the perfectly arranged lights, all of it seemed smaller somehow, diminished in significance by the truth that had been laid bare. This world, built on appearances and assumptions, had faltered in the face of honesty and dignity. I felt a quiet satisfaction in that realization, a warmth that had nothing to do with the holiday, wealth, or prestige. The guests remained behind, murmuring quietly, some glancing toward my son with curiosity, others toward his wife with subtle concern. The dynamic had shifted irreversibly. My departure carried weight, not because I had raised my voice or demanded acknowledgement, but because I had acted with a clarity and authority that forced them, and everyone watching, to recognize the imbalance that had been carefully concealed. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and snow. I breathed deeply, feeling the chill brush against my face and the relief of being free from the oppressive tension that had dominated the dinner. The streetlights reflected softly on the pavement, the quiet hum of distant traffic reminding me that life continued beyond the walls of that house, beyond the social expectations and performances, beyond the facade that had so carefully been maintained. I paused by my car, fingers resting lightly on the door handle. I thought of the years that had led me here, the sacrifices, the late nights, the small, often unnoticed acts of love and support that had shaped my son's life. I thought of the pride I had felt raising him, the quiet satisfaction of watching him grow into a capable, intelligent man, and the sting of seeing that growth distorted by wealth and performance. And yet, tonight, I felt a sense of reclamation. I had not demanded respect, I had not sought approval. I had simply allowed truth and dignity to speak for themselves. As I drove home, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white, the familiar streets unfolding before me like a path back to reality. My apartment, modest and unassuming, awaited me, a space that had always held warmth, familiarity, and the quiet validation that comes from being true to oneself. I reflected on the events of the evening, the tension, the exposure, and the subtle satisfaction that had accompanied it. I had left without confrontation, without anger, and without the need for dramatic closure. Yet the impact was undeniable. Over the following days, I noticed subtle changes. My son's demeanor shifted when we spoke, a trace of humility creeping into his tone. His wife avoided the topics she had once confidently navigated, no longer attempting to control or manipulate our interactions. And the guests who had attended that dinner, friends, colleagues, associates, shared stories in hushed tones, recounting the quiet authority I had exercised and the moral balance that had shifted. The truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken, and it carried with it consequences far beyond the walls of that dining room. I received no phone calls demanding explanations, no confrontations, no arguments. My presence, my calm observation, and the revelation of truth had been sufficient. It was a lesson that did not require repetition, an assertion of dignity that needed no amplification. I found myself smiling quietly at the irony, the very tools of performance, wealth, and authority that had once overshadowed me were powerless in the face of patience, observation, and integrity. In the weeks that followed, I maintained my distance, not out of anger or spite, but out of a quiet recognition that boundaries, once respected, do not need to be constantly enforced. My son reached out occasionally, offering polite conversation and tentative attempts at connection. I responded calmly, without bitterness, allowing him to navigate the relationship on terms that respected both of us. It was a subtle reclamation of authority, not through confrontation, but through consistent presence, dignity, and truth. I reflected often on the nature of family, respect, and integrity. Wealth, influence, and social performance could create illusions of power, but they could not substitute for honesty, care, and genuine connection. The evening of that Christmas dinner had crystallized these lessons in a way that was unforgettable, leaving an impression not only on my son and his wife, but on the entire circle of guests who had witnessed it. There was a sense of quiet triumph in knowing that I had acted with composure and patience, that I had allowed the truth to surface in a way that required no shouting, no confrontation, and no spectacle. The dignity I carried, earned through decades of hard work, quiet sacrifice, and unwavering integrity, had spoken louder than any claim of money or generosity ever could. As the holiday season drew to a close, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. My son, once distant and performative, had glimpsed the consequences of assumptions, lies, and manipulations. His wife, whose control had seemed absolute, had seen the limits of orchestration, and I, steadfast in my patience, had reclaimed a sense of authority, respect, and self-worth that no amount of wealth or social maneuvering could diminish. The Christmas tree in my apartment glowed softly in the corner, simple yet comforting, a stark contrast to the ostentation I had witnessed at the mansion. I sat in my chair, sipping coffee and reflecting on the events, feeling a profound sense of peace. The evening had been challenging, tense, and emotionally charged, but it had also reaffirmed essential truths about family, respect, and the power of quiet dignity. I knew that our relationships would continue, shaped by the experiences of that night, but I also knew that I had established an unassailable foundation. Respect could not be demanded. It could not be bought, and it could not be faked. It could only be earned and maintained through honesty, integrity, and consistent action. And tonight, I had demonstrated all three, not through words of anger, but through patience, observation, and the subtle assertion of truth. As I prepared for bed, the faint scent of pine lingering in the apartment, I allowed myself a small smile. Christmas had brought many surprises, some joyous, others challenging, but none more meaningful than the quiet reclamation of dignity and the restoration of moral balance. The events of that evening would remain with me, not as a source of resentment or regret, but as a testament to the enduring power of truth, integrity, and self-respect. And in that moment, I realized something profound: wealth, influence, and social appearances may impress the world, but they are powerless in the face of quiet authority and unwavering truth. The true legacy of a parent, a father, is not measured in money or status, but in the values imparted, the patience exercised, and the integrity upheld, even in the most challenging circumstances. I closed my eyes, feeling the calm settle over me, a stark contrast to the tension and performance of the evening before. The story had unfolded exactly as it needed to, and I had navigated it with the grace, patience, and quiet authority that defined me. My son had learned a lesson in humility. His wife had glimpsed the limits of control, and I had reaffirmed the enduring power of dignity. In the quiet of my apartment, under the soft glow of the Christmas tree, I felt a sense of completion. The evening had been a test, a challenge to patience, and a confrontation with appearances, and it had revealed something essential about the nature of family, respect, and truth. I had walked out with my name intact, my dignity preserved, and my authority quietly, but unmistakably asserted. The night passed peacefully, and with it, a sense of closure settled in. Christmas had offered not just celebration, but revelation, not just gifts, but lessons in integrity and patience. And I knew, with a calm certainty that could not be shaken, that the events of that evening had left an indelible mark, not only on those present, but on the very foundation of our family.